Mention Motown, and you immediately think of gentlemen in sharp suits like The Temptations or Marvin Gaye. But there is a secret Motown buried. In the mid-70s, the lead singer of one of their hottest R&B groups was a man who bravely wore false eyelashes and eyeliner on stage. His name was Tony Washington, but behind that makeup was the brutal underground sexual reality of a black artist. Shut out from public bars, Tony's gay life took place at underground house parties, where married down-low men sneaked in to satisfy their lust in the dark, only to pretend they didn't know him the next morning. The Motown system drained his voice dry, while those fake straight men drained his body. In 1989, Tony collapsed and died of AIDS. The R&B industry instantly turned its back, wiping out his legacy as if he never existed. Tony Washington was born on February 7, 1949 in Washington, D.C. He was a pioneer in American rhythm and blues, an artist who navigated the extreme pressures of the mid-century music industry as a gay black man by transforming his public performances into coded expressions of his private reality. Tony, alongside his younger brother Maurice, spent his childhood in a public housing development in Northeast Washington, D.C. From an early age, Tony demonstrated a profound, almost obsessive inclination toward vocal performance. While economic resources in their neighborhood were severely limited, the area possessed a rich, localized vocal harmony tradition. Tony did not receive formal conservatory training. Instead, his vocal education occurred entirely within the community. He learned pitch control and harmonization by participating in impromptu singing groups that gathered in the neighborhood. By the time Tony entered Spingarn High School, his distinct falsetto was already developing. Maurice, attending nearby Eastern High School, shared this musical drive. Together, the brothers began recruiting classmates and neighborhood peers to form a structured vocal group. Tony took on the role of the lead vocalist and the primary emotional anchor of their sound. They rehearsed obsessively. They sought out specific acoustic environments, tiled school bathrooms, stairwells, and enclosed alleyways to perfect the tight, multi-part harmonies required for the soul and R&B music of the early 1960s. Tony drove the group's work ethic, insisting on absolute precision in their vocal blend. The transition from neighborhood harmonizing to professional performance happened rapidly. Tony and his group sought out every available talent showcase and amateur competition within the D.C. metropolitan area. Their vocal proficiency quickly outpaced their age. In the mid-1960s, the local club circuit was the only viable path to industry exposure and financial compensation. Because they were legally minors, Tony and the other members systematically lied about their ages. They fabricated identification and convinced venue managers they were old enough to perform. This forced Tony into adult environments, navigating late-night club scenes, dealing with promoters, and singing for mature audiences while he was still a teenager. This grueling local circuit hardened his work ethic and gave him an unfiltered view of the transactional nature of the entertainment business. By 1968, the vocal group had solidified into a permanent, highly disciplined unit. This year marked a critical turning point in Tony's life. The members had been performing together for years, generating a modest but steady income from local gigs. In an extraordinary move for a group of young working-class musicians, they pooled their earnings and collectively purchased a house in Washington, D.C. Moving in together established a boundary between the group and the outside world. Inside this house, the members made a definitive collective pact. They swore never to marry, pledging their entire lives and loyalty solely to their music. On a professional level, this vow ensured that no member would abandon the group for domestic responsibilities. For Tony Washington, however, this pact served a much more vital, personal function. In the late 1960s, the pressure to conform to traditional heterosexual marriage was immense, particularly within the Black community where conventional family structures were heavily emphasized. As a gay man, Tony faced a society that offered no space for his authentic identity. The expectation to find a wife and settle down was a looming psychological threat, one that many gay men of the era succumbed to by entering into sham marriages to maintain social standing and avoid suspicion. The group's vow to remain unmarried provided Tony with a socially acceptable ironclad alibi. By hiding behind the guise of ultimate artistic dedication, Tony bypassed the intense scrutiny of his bachelorhood. The house and the vow became a protective fortress, granting him the autonomy to develop his immense vocal talent without being forced into a false, heterosexual domestic life. By the early 1970s, the dynamic superiors had largely exhausted the upward mobility available within the regional Washington, D.C. entertainment circuit. The group had spent years rigorously performing in local venues, establishing a reputation for their meticulous vocal harmonies and synchronized stage choreography. However, the American rhythm and blues industry was highly centralized, with the primary avenues for national distribution and radio syndication controlled by a select few major record labels. For a vocal group to transition from regional act to national prominence, securing a contract with a major label was a strict operational necessity. During this period, the landscape of soul music was undergoing a significant structural and sonic transition. The genre was moving away from the raw, driving sound of 1960s Southern soul and the early, punchy pop soul of Detroit. In its place, the market was increasingly dominated by the lush, heavily orchestrated productions emerging from Philadelphia International Records, characterized by sweeping string arrangements and highly emotive lead vocals. Concurrently, Motown Records, the preeminent force in Black American music, was finalizing its corporate relocation from Detroit, Michigan to Los Angeles, California. As part of this transition, Motown executives were actively scouting for new talent capable of competing with the shifting sonic trends and maintaining the label's dominant market share. When Motown talent scouts encountered the dynamic superiors, the group's cohesive background harmonies were noted, but the decisive factor in securing their recording contract was the lead vocal capacity of Tony Washington. Within the competitive ecosystem of 1970s R&B, a distinctive lead vocalist was the primary commercial asset of any group. Washington possessed a highly specialized and technically demanding vocal instrument, a soaring, meticulously controlled falsetto. The male falsetto has a long and complex history within Black American music, rooted heavily in the gospel quartet tradition, where the top tenor often utilized the upper register to project over the congregation and convey a state of spiritual transcendence. By the 1970s, this vocal technique had been firmly adapted for secular rhythm and blues. Washington's specific timbre, however, distinguished him from his contemporaries. Music historians and vocal coaches frequently categorize falsetto singers of that era into different stylistic camps. While vocalists like Russell Tompkins Jr. of the Stylistics utilized a remarkably smooth, almost ethereal and weightless falsetto, and Ted Mills of Blue Magic employed a slightly more piercing, theatrical upper register, Washington's voice retained a distinct grounded resonance. Industry professionals referred to it as a churchy falsetto. Despite operating in the highest vocal ranges, his delivery maintained a slight rasp and a heavy vibrato that directly echoed traditional gospel singing. This specific vocal texture gave Washington's performances an inherent, deeply ingrained sense of vulnerability. Audio engineers and producers who worked with the group observed that Washington had the technical ability to make his voice sound as though it were fracturing under the weight of emotional distress. His phrasing and breath control allowed him to sustain high notes with a slight, deliberate quiver, creating an auditory illusion that he was on the verge of weeping. In the context of recorded music, where the listener cannot see the performer, this ability to transmit raw, palpable melancholy through vocal tone alone was an exceptionally rare and highly valuable commodity. Upon signing the Dynamic Superiors, Motown Records immediately initiated their standard artist development and production protocols. The label's operational model was highly regimented. Artists were systematically paired with specific in-house songwriters and producers who were tasked with manufacturing hit records tailored to the artist's vocal strengths. Recognizing the unique pathos in Washington's voice, Motown executives assigned the group to the legendary songwriting and production duo Nicholas Ashford and Valerie Simpson. Ashford and Simpson were highly esteemed architects of romantic soul music. They had an established track record of writing complex, emotionally resonant hits for major Motown acts, including Marvin Gaye and Tammy Terrell, as well as Diana Ross. The duo possessed a sophisticated understanding of vocal arrangement and emotional pacing within a 3-minute pop song. When presented with the Dynamic Superiors, Ashford and Simpson did not attempt to write upbeat, dance-oriented tracks. Instead, they strategically focused on Washington's capacity for conveying heartbreak. They understood that his churchy falsetto was most effective when contrasted against lush, melancholic instrumentation. The recording sessions that followed were exercises in precision engineering. Ashford and Simpson constructed elaborate backing tracks featuring slow tempos, prominent bass lines, and sweeping orchestral strings. Against this instrumental backdrop, they placed Washington's vocals front and center. The background vocals provided by the other members of the Dynamic Superiors were arranged to serve as a supportive harmonic cushion designed specifically to elevate and isolate Washington's lead lines. The apex of this strategic collaboration was the development and recording of the ballad Cry When You Want To. The composition was meticulously tailored to exploit every facet of Washington's vocal capability. The lyrical narrative of the song deals with profound romantic resignation and the agonizing process of offering comfort to a partner who is emotionally distant. To execute the track, Washington had to navigate complex melodic intervals, dropping from his soaring falsetto into his chest voice and back again, requiring immense breath support and technical agility. In the studio booth, under the direction of Ashford and Simpson, Washington delivered a masterclass in emotive vocalization. He utilized the tears in the voice technique to its maximum effect, stretching the vowels and manipulating his vibrato to simulate genuine auditory sobbing without losing melodic pitch. For Motown Records, this was the exact outcome desired. The resulting tracks were not merely artistic achievements, they were precisely engineered commercial products. In the mid-1970s, the primary demographic for rhythm and blues ballads was adult women. Market research and sales data indicated that female consumers responded overwhelmingly to male vocalists who exhibited emotional accessibility and romantic vulnerability. Washington's ability to project intense, unshielded emotional pain made him an incredibly effective tool for engaging this target audience. The industry machinery moved swiftly to capitalize on these recordings. The songs were pressed, distributed to radio syndicates, and heavily promoted across the nation's R&B stations. The emotional weight of the music, driven entirely by Washington's soaring, church-inflected falsetto, resonated immediately with the listening public. The dynamic Superiors were transformed from a hard-working local act into national recording artists. Washington's voice had successfully penetrated the mainstream market, establishing him as a premier vocalist. Yet, this success was built upon a profound paradox. The music industry had commodified his ability to express deep romantic longing and heartbreak, packaging it for mass consumption, while the actual lived reality of his romantic life and the societal restrictions placed upon it remained a subject that the same industry would absolutely forbid him from articulating in the daylight. As the dynamic Superiors achieved national chart success and their music began to permeate radio stations across the United States, Tony Washington found himself navigating a profound and highly specific type of isolation. The mid-1970s marked a period of immense public visibility for the group. They were traveling, performing on national television programs, and engaging with a rapidly expanding fan base. Yet the fame that afforded Washington financial stability and professional validation simultaneously magnified the severe restrictions placed upon his personal life. He was a prominent, openly gay black man operating within a society that was structurally designed to render his identity invisible. The daily psychological weight of Washington's existence was rooted deeply within the complex, heavily guarded social geography of the 1970s. The broader LGBTQ+ rights movement had gained momentum following the Stonewall riots of 1969, but the liberation it promised was highly stratified. Washington existed at the intersection of two deeply entrenched prejudices, resulting in a state of dual marginalization. Within the mainstream, predominantly white gay communities of major metropolitan areas, severe racial segregation was a standard practice. Many established gay bars and clubs actively discriminated against black patrons through arbitrary dress codes, discriminatory identification checks, or outright refusal of entry. Conversely, within the broader black community, there was virtually no public space or social tolerance for homosexuality. The civil rights movement and the prominent role of the conservative black church had established strict codes of respectability politics. Homosexuality was frequently categorized not merely as a moral failing, but as a direct threat to the cohesion and advancement of the community. Consequently, Washington could not simply walk into a public establishment to seek out companionship or romantic partnership. the public sphere offered no sanctuary. Instead, he and thousands of other gay black men relied entirely on a sophisticated invisible network of underground spaces. This network was primarily composed of private house parties and discreet after-hours clubs located in residential basements or unmarked industrial buildings. These spaces were intensely guarded, operating strictly on a word-of-mouth basis to prevent police raids or public exposure. For Washington, these dimly lit, closed-door environments represented the only physical locations in the world where he could momentarily drop his public guard. However, the sanctuary provided by this underground network was inherently flawed and often fraught with emotional peril. Because society mandated compulsory heterosexuality, many of the men who frequented these private parties lived heavily compartmentalized lives. This historical dynamic, frequently referred to within the community as living on the down low, involved men who maintained the outward appearance of traditional heterosexual lives. Many held respectable jobs, maintained prominent positions in their communities, and were legally married to women. They ventured into the underground house parties exclusively under the cover of darkness, seeking same-sex intimacy in absolute secrecy. As a recognizable recording artist who did not hide his sexuality, Washington became a distinct focal point within this hidden ecosystem. Contemporaries and historians of the era note that his visibility made him both a figure of admiration and a convenient target. In the protective shadow of the house parties, Washington frequently interacted and formed intimate connections with these men. He offered them a space of genuine acceptance. Yet the fundamental tragedy of these interactions lay in the stark contrast between nighttime intimacy and daylight reality. The societal pressure to maintain a heterosexual facade bred a profound cruelty among the men who sought his company. Acutely aware that public association with Washington could destroy their carefully constructed lives, the same individuals who shared intimate moments with him in basement clubs would routinely enforce a brutal distance in the daylight. If Washington encountered them on the street or within the music industry, he was met with cold indifference or, worse, performative homophobic mocking to deflect suspicion. The psychological toll of this recurring cycle was immense. Washington was repeatedly forced to act as a silent vault for their hidden truths, absorbing their shame and paranoia while receiving no romantic security in return. He sang national hit records about the beauty of reciprocal love, yet his lived reality was defined by this deeply transactional, jarring whiplash between private affection and public disavowal. Through this intense emotional gauntlet, the other members of the dynamic superiors remained a critical line of defense. The fraternal bond they had forged on the street corners of Washington, D.C. held firm. His bandmates did not merely tolerate his identity, they actively shielded him. In an industry rife with predatory behavior and casual homophobia, the group operated as a protective phalanx around their lead singer. They managed interactions with hostile promoters, deflected aggressive press inquiries, and provided a physical barrier against the overt prejudice they encountered while touring. Yet, despite the unwavering loyalty of his bandmates, they could not cure the fundamental loneliness of his situation. They could protect his physical safety and his professional standing, but they could not dismantle the systemic homophobia that dictated the terms of his romantic life. Washington was forced to construct rigid psychological compartments to survive. There was the consummate professional in the recording studio, the protected brother within the vocal group, and the isolated man navigating the perilous transient affections of the underground house parties. This continuous emotional suppression, the necessity of hiding his true romantic realities while projecting vulnerability to millions of fans, began to build an immense internal pressure. It was only a matter of time before this carefully contained reality would find a way to fracture the polished surface of his public performances. The immense psychological pressure generated by Washington's dual existence required an outlet. The stifling environment of the underground house parties and the rigid expectations of public life created a volatile internal containment system. For Washington, the physical stage became the only sanctioned space where this pressure could be released. Historically, the stage has often functioned as a liminal zone for performers, a designated area where societal rules are temporarily suspended. For a marginalized artist in the 1970s, live performance was not merely a career obligation, it was a vital mechanism for psychological survival. When Washington stepped under the theatrical lights, the rigid compartments of his life dissolved. The stage transformed into a sanctuary where he could assert his reality in plain sight, utilizing the very music that confined him to broadcast a coded yet fiercely visible confession. Washington's stage presence stood in stark, revolutionary contrast against the polished, uniform aesthetic of standard 1970s rhythm and blues. The era was defined by a specific brand of polished, uniform masculinity. Groups like the Temptations, the Four Tops, and the OJs performed in matching, sharply tailored suits, executing precise, synchronized choreography that projected a unified front of traditional male virility and romantic suave. Washington systematically dismantled this paradigm. While the other four members of the Dynamic Superiors maintained the conventional uniformed backing formation, Washington deliberately visually isolated himself. He introduced elements of female impersonation and drag into his performance aesthetic, breaking the unspoken visual codes of the genre. He openly wore heavy theatrical makeup, false eyelashes, and garments that blurred the lines of traditional gender presentation. This was not executed as a comedic routine or a novelty act, but as a genuine, unapologetic extension of his identity. The most profound manifestation of this performative defiance occurred in his interaction with the musical material itself. The repertoire of the Dynamic Superiors was heavily anchored in traditional love songs. However, Washington revolutionized these tracks through live interpretation. His most historically significant act of subversion involved the Billy Paul classic, Me and Mrs. Jones. Originally written and recorded as a narrative of heterosexual infidelity, the song was a staple of 1970s soul radio. During live concerts, Washington would seize control of the narrative, actively altering the lyrics in real time. He changed the focal point of the song, singing Me and Mr. Jones. This lyrical alteration was an electric and highly dangerous choice. Washington did not whisper the change. He emphasized it, often shouting Mr. Jones into the microphone, forcing the audience to confront the reality of male-to-male desire. Furthermore, he would physically engage with the audience, directing his sweeping emotional vocal runs toward male patrons seated in the front rows, sometimes serenading them directly. In the context of mid-1970s Black America, where public displays of homosexuality could invite severe physical violence and immediate professional ruin, this act was revolutionary. It was a direct confrontational broadcast of his hidden truth. He was taking the soundtrack of compulsory heterosexuality and weaponizing it to acknowledge the men in the shadows, delivering a raw, unfiltered confession to anyone willing to listen. Surprisingly, the executive leadership at Motown Records did not immediately attempt to censor this behavior. Instead, the corporation engaged in a cold, strategic calculation. The music industry in the mid-1970s was highly saturated. Motown was facing fierce competition from other labels and was constantly searching for unique angles to differentiate their artists. When executives observed Washington's polarizing stage presence, they did not see a civil rights pioneer. They saw a highly marketable commodity. They recognized that his aesthetic subversion possessed immense shock value. In an era before the widespread normalization of queer aesthetics in pop music, Washington's gender-fluid presentation was a visual spectacle that could cut through the noise of the crowded R&B market. Motown actively leaned into this controversy, transitioning from a music label into a curator of provocation. The marketing department deliberately packaged Washington's identity into a visual branding strategy. This shift is starkly evident in the group's discography artwork. For their eponymous 1975 debut album, The Dynamic Superiors, the cover photography prominently featured Washington centered among his bandmates. However, while the other members were styled conservatively, Washington was photographed with a deeply unbuttoned shirt, heavily applied blue eyeshadow, and prominent false eyelashes. The imagery was explicitly designed to provoke questions and generate industry chatter. The label escalated this strategy with the release of the group's second album, Pure Pleasure, in 1976. The cover art for this record completely abandoned traditional portraiture in favor of provocative visual semiotics. The artwork depicted a bathtub filled with bubbles. Emerging from the water were a pair of undeniably masculine, muscular legs, while resting on the edge of the tub was a pair of masculine hands. The fingernails painted a striking glossy red. This imagery was a deliberate, corporate-sponsored broadcast of gender nonconformity. Motown was effectively monetizing the very identity that society forced Washington to hide, turning his marginalized existence into a commercial hook. The ultimate tragedy of this era, however, lay in the disconnect between the corporate packaging and the man himself. The music industry successfully branded Tony Washington as an outrageous, boundary-pushing provocateur. Yet those who knew him intimately understood a deeply contrasting reality. Valerie Simpson, who spent countless hours observing Washington during their recording sessions, later articulated this profound paradox in historical interviews. She noted that outside of the performative requirements of the stage and the label's promotional directives, Washington was remarkably conservative. In his daily life, he did not seek out shock value. He dressed modestly, possessed a quiet demeanor, and did not naturally gravitate toward the flamboyant aesthetic the label pushed upon him. He was not an activist attempting to shock the bourgeoisie. He was simply a vocalist who wanted the freedom to be honest about who he loved. But the corporate machinery of the 1970s music industry lacked the nuance to market authentic, normalized gay life. The system only understood how to sell the extreme. Therefore, Washington was forced into a new type of performance. To maintain his recording contract and ensure the survival of his group, he had to participate in his own commodification, allowing the industry to take his deeply personal, quiet truth and distort it into a loud, profitable spectacle. He achieved the visibility he craved, but it was heavily filtered through the cynical lens of commercial exploitation, leaving him visible to the world, yet entirely misunderstood. By the latter half of the 1970s, Tony Washington had developed a sharp, conscious understanding of his historical position. He was no longer simply navigating the industry day by day. He recognized the broader cultural implications of his presence in the public eye. In a pivotal 1977 interview, Washington explicitly articulated his internal motivations, stating that he was actively attempting to push the clock forward. This phrase was not merely a casual remark, it was a profound declaration of intent. In the context of 1977 America, pushing the clock forward was a formidable undertaking. The national socio-political climate was growing increasingly hostile toward the LGBTQ+ community. This was the exact historical moment when singer Anita Bryant launched the Save Our Children campaign in Dade County, Florida, sparking a highly organized nationwide political movement to repeal local anti-discrimination ordinances and codify homophobia into law. Against this backdrop of rising conservative backlash, Washington's continued public visibility required immense personal fortitude. He understood that his stage performances and his unapologetic aesthetic were serving a function far greater than entertainment. Archival accounts and reflections from contemporaries indicate that a quiet, highly significant subculture began to form around the Dynamic Superiors live shows. Backstage areas and stage doors became sites of discreet but powerful interactions. LGBTQ+ fans, many of whom were living entirely closeted lives due to the severe professional and physical risks of the era, would seek Washington out after performances. They came to offer quiet words of gratitude. For these individuals, witnessing a black man stand on a national stage, commanding an audience while refusing to hide his identity, provided a rare and vital point of validation. Historically, Washington's aesthetic and performative choices during this period laid the critical groundwork for the cultural shifts that would occur in the following decades. He introduced and normalized the intersection of rhythm and blues, funk, and homoerotica. He tested the boundaries of gender presentation in mainstream black music, absorbing the initial shock and backlash, which subsequently lowered the barriers of entry for future artists. The gender-fluid aesthetics and vocal stylings that would later be celebrated and wildly commercialized by global icons such as Sylvester in the disco era and Prince or George Michael in the 1980s pop landscape were directly foreshadowed by Washington's isolated efforts in the mid-1970s. He was the vanguard, absorbing the friction of breaking new ground. However, being the vanguard in a commercial industry often carries a devastating personal cost. The music business operates on a strict timeline of risk assessment and return on investment. Washington had simply arrived too early. Despite the group maintaining a dedicated fan base and achieving charting success with singles like Shoo Shoo Shine, the forward momentum of the Dynamic Superiors began to noticeably stall as the decade progressed. The mechanics of this career stagnation were not accidental. They were the result of a systematic withdrawal of institutional support. The rhythm and blues market and the broader music industry were undergoing a significant transition. As the initial novelty of Washington's provocative image wore off, the executive leadership at Motown Records faced a shifting cultural tide. The rise of the anti-gay political movements in the late 1970s began to influence consumer behavior and, more importantly, the gatekeepers of radio syndication. Program directors at conservative radio stations became increasingly hesitant to place the dynamic superiors in heavy rotation, fearing backlash from advertisers and listeners over Washington's public identity. In the music industry, when radio support wavers, label executives quickly recalibrate their financial priorities. It became widely understood among industry insiders that Motown began to view Washington not as a cutting-edge marketing asset, but as an increasing commercial liability. The label's strategy shifted from promotion to containment. The mechanisms of this freeze-out were cold and bureaucratic. Promotional budgets for the group's new releases were drastically reduced. Funding for national tours and high-profile television appearances was quietly withdrawn. The group was no longer paired with top-tier songwriters and producers like Ashford and Simpson. This withdrawal of resources is a standard industry tactic used to slowly suffocate an artist's career without the negative publicity of a formal contract termination. Without financial backing and marketing infrastructure, even the most talented vocal group cannot sustain national relevance. The dynamic superiors found themselves trapped in a deteriorating situation. They were still under contract, but the machinery required to advance their careers had been turned off. The psychological strain of this systematic abandonment fell heaviest on Washington. He had sacrificed his privacy, endured the physical risks of being openly gay in a hostile era, and allowed his identity to be commodified to secure his group's success. Now, the very system that had packaged and profited from his courage was methodically discarding him. The definitive severing of this relationship occurred at the dawn of a new decade. In 1980, the Dynamic Superiors released their final studio album. The most notable aspect of this record was not its sonic direction, but its personnel. Tony Washington, the founding member, the lead vocalist, and the undeniable emotional core of the group did not appear on the album. The details surrounding his departure from the recording sessions, whether he was formally pushed out by label executives demanding a more conservative image, or if the internal pressure simply became too immense to continue, remain a point of historical ambiguity. What is irrefutable, however, is the result. The soaring, church-inflected falsetto that had defined the group's sound and brought them to national prominence was silenced. The industry had extracted the commercial value from his voice and his image, and when the cultural climate shifted, he was quietly and cleanly erased from the roster. The abrupt severing of Tony Washington's professional career in 1980 initiated a period of profound personal disorientation and physical decline. For an artist whose entire adult life had been structured around rehearsal schedules, recording sessions, and live performances, the sudden silence was deafening. The stage had functioned not merely as a workplace, but as a vital psychological release valve. It was the only environment where he could exert control over his narrative and assert his identity without immediate physical danger. Deprived of this public platform, the carefully constructed compartments of his life collapsed inward. The immense psychological pressure he had absorbed over the preceding decade, the constant vigilance against homophobia, the exhaustion of the touring circuit, and the trauma of engaging with the clandestine, down-low culture no longer had an outlet. Without the protective structure of the music industry or the collective shield of his bandmates, Washington was forced to retreat entirely into the private sphere. He returned full-time to the marginalized, subterranean world of Washington, D.C.'s underground gay community. However, the dynamics of this environment were shifting drastically. During the height of his fame, his celebrity status had provided a certain degree of insulation within these private spaces. He had been a star, a figure of admiration whom closeted men sought out. Stripped of his recording contract and his public visibility, he faced the harsh reality of navigating this complex social ecosystem simply as a vulnerable individual. The transactional nature of the underground, where affection was often temporary and public acknowledgement was strictly forbidden, became his permanent and only reality. Biographers and medical historians note that the human body cannot infinitely sustain the level of chronic psychological stress Washington had endured. The prolonged necessity of suppressing his authentic self, combined with the recurring emotional whiplash of private intimacy and public rejection, began to exact a severe somatic toll. Long before any formal medical diagnosis, those within his immediate circle observed significant changes in his physical demeanor. The vibrant, highly energetic performer who once dominated national television stages was increasingly replaced by a figure exhibiting profound chronic exhaustion. He experienced severe weight fluctuations and a general weakening of his physical constitution. The burden of maintaining a double life for over a decade had functioned as a slow attritional assault on his baseline health. Tragically, this period of compromised physical and emotional resilience coincided with a catastrophic public health crisis. In the early 1980s, an aggressive and unidentified illness began to circulate through the very underground networks that Washington relied upon for community and survival. The onset of the HIV/AIDS epidemic was particularly devastating for the Black gay population. The systemic societal pressures that forced these men into hidden, unregulated spaces inadvertently created the exact conditions necessary for the rapid, unchecked transmission of the virus. The intense secrecy demanded by the down-low culture, driven by the absolute terror of being outed, meant that individuals could not openly discuss their health, seek early medical intervention, or share critical information about the emerging disease. The closet, initially constructed as a social shield, transformed into a biological trap. As the epidemic gained momentum, it swept mercilessly through the private house parties and after-hours clubs. Washington, deeply embedded in this network, contracted the virus. The diagnosis plunged him into a nightmare of intersecting stigmas. In the mid-1980s, the national response to the AIDS crisis was characterized by severe governmental negligence, intense medical uncertainty, and widespread public panic. For a Black gay man, the diagnosis carried an unparalleled level of social condemnation. Mainstream society viewed the disease as a moral failing, while conservative segments of the Black community often framed it as a shameful punishment, leading to the absolute ostracization of the afflicted. Washington was forced to face his physical deterioration in near total isolation. The medical infrastructure available to marginalized communities during this era was chronically underfunded and deeply prejudiced. Patients routinely faced hostility from medical professionals, and the rudimentary treatments available were often as physically punishing as the disease itself. Washington's body, already worn down by years of psychological strain, was systematically dismantled by the virus. The progression of AIDS involves the aggressive degradation of the immune system, leaving the individual susceptible to a host of debilitating, opportunistic infections. The physical toll of the disease struck at the very core of his identity. Washington's voice, the soaring, churchy falsetto that had secured his fame and served as his primary means of expression, relied entirely on immense physical stamina, precise breath control, and muscular diaphragm support. As the illness progressed, respiratory complications and extreme physical wasting stripped him of the biological mechanics required to sing. The ability to sustain high notes, to manipulate his vibrato, and to project emotional power was slowly suffocated. The tragic irony was absolute. An artist who had spent his career translating deep internal pain into beautiful, resonant sound was ultimately silenced by a disease that systematically destroyed his capacity to draw breath. He spent his final years completely removed from the public eye, managing the severe pain and rapid physical wasting associated with late-stage AIDS. The man who had bravely attempted to push the cultural clock forward, who had serenaded millions and challenged the rigid gender norms of his era, was reduced to fighting a losing battle against an invisible enemy in the shadows. The vibrant costumes and the bold stage presence were replaced by the harsh clinical reality of a devastating illness. His decline occurred during the absolute peak of the American AIDS panic, a time when fear was so pervasive that even basic physical comfort from friends or family was often denied to the dying. He was entirely isolated from the industry he helped shape, left to endure the final grueling stages of the disease without public recognition or institutional support. In 1989, Tony Washington passed away from complications related to AIDS. He was 40 years old. His death occurred during a period of profound national crisis, at a time when the American medical infrastructure and the general public were gripped by intense fear and prejudice regarding the epidemic. The circumstances of his final days stood in stark, devastating contrast to the heights of his public career. A man who had once stood on national television, projecting a powerful, soaring voice to millions of listeners, ultimately succumbed to an illness that systematically robbed him of his physical strength and his vocal capacity in near total isolation. The immediate aftermath of Washington's death revealed the strict, unforgiving boundaries of the music industry he had helped enrich. When a prominent recording artist passes away, standard industry protocol dictates a wave of public mourning, official press releases from the record label, tribute segments on music television, and dedicated airplay on syndicated radio stations. For Tony Washington, there was only silence. Motown Records, the institution that had once capitalized on his image and distributed his voice worldwide, issued no formal statement. Mainstream R&B radio stations, which had heavily rotated hits like Shoo Shoo Shine, did not organize retrospectives. Major entertainment publications offered no obituaries detailing his contributions to the genre. This institutional silence was not an accidental oversight. It was a deliberate, protective measure dictated by the social politics of the late 1980s. The stigma attached to HIV/AIDS, particularly concerning gay men, was so severe that corporate entities and media conglomerates routinely engaged in active historical erasure. Acknowledging Washington's death would have required acknowledging the manner in which he died, which in turn would have forced the industry to confront his sexuality and the underground reality he navigated. To protect the sanitized, marketable image of mainstream rhythm and blues, the industry gatekeepers chose to simply look away. His passing was treated not as the loss of a vocal pioneer, but as an uncomfortable liability that needed to be quietly swept out of the public record. The erasure extended deep into the core of his musical family. The death of Tony Washington irrevocably shattered the dynamic Superiors. The group was not merely a professional ensemble, it was a brotherhood forged in the housing projects of Washington, D.C., bound by a 1968 pact to forsake marriage and dedicate their lives entirely to their collective harmony. Without their lead vocalist and emotional center, the remaining members found it impossible to continue. The precise vocal blend they had spent decades perfecting could not be replicated. Following Washington's death, the group formally disbanded, and the individual members dispersed, stepping entirely away from the national spotlight. The silence that enveloped Washington's passing effectively marked the end of the dynamic Superior's active history. For decades, Tony Washington's legacy remained dormant, buried beneath the accelerated turnover of pop culture and the deliberate omissions of official industry narratives. Throughout the 1990s and early 2000s, as R&B music evolved and new generations of artists took the stage, the contributions of the mid-1970s gender-bending pioneers were largely attributed to more famous, later arriving figures. Washington was relegated to the margins of music history, a footnote occasionally remembered by dedicated vinyl collectors or those who had been present in the underground club scene of his era. The albums he recorded, with their provocative covers and meticulously arranged vocals, sat in archival vaults, entirely disconnected from the profound human struggle that produced them. It was only with the advent of extensive digital archiving and the deliberate efforts of modern cultural historians that a fuller, more accurate picture of Washington's life began to emerge. Researchers, musicologists, and archivists dedicated to uncovering the suppressed histories of marginalized artists began to re-examine the landscape of 1970s soul music. They looked beyond the Billboard charts and the sanitized label press releases, digging into the complex intersections of race, sexuality, and commercial music production. Through this retrospective lens, Tony Washington's true historical position was finally recognized. Historians now identify him as a crucial vanguard. He occupied a highly precarious space, bridging the conservative traditions of mid-century vocal groups and the progressive, identity-driven artistry that would define later decades. When modern audiences review his performances, specifically his audacity to stand before mid-1970s crowds and redirect classic love songs toward male pronouns, they witness an act of immense bravery He was asserting his right to exist within a genre that fundamentally denied his reality. The tragedy of Tony Washington lies in the immense personal cost of his pioneering status. He was a man forced to partition his existence to survive. His soaring falsetto captured the very essence of human connection, turning him into a highly profitable spectacle. Yet, the brutal irony remained. The man whose voice defined romantic devotion for millions was structurally forbidden from loving in the daylight. However, when the cultural climate shifted and the physical toll of his hidden life manifested in a stigmatized illness, the same commercial structures abandoned him without hesitation. He was utilized for his sound and his shock value, and then systematically forgotten when he was no longer profitable. Today, the recordings of the dynamic superiors stand as much more than vintage rhythm and blues tracks. They serve as a vital historical document. When one listens to Tony Washington's voice on records like Cry When You Want To, the emotional resonance is no longer just a testament to his technical skill. It is a profound reflection of his lived reality. His music was indeed a coded confession. He left behind an auditory diary of a man who navigated immense isolation, who sought connection in the shadows, and who utilized a microphone to broadcast his truth to a world that was not yet ready to hear it. His legacy is ultimately defined by the enduring power of that voice, a voice that outlasted the silence imposed upon it, demanding to be heard and finally understood.